Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch the interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me. Hello and welcome to a special interview for The Wire. In 1948 to 1949, B.R. Ambedkar warned India about its attitude to the Constitution. Are we guilty of ignoring those warnings? Has our hero worship created autocrats? Does our democracy fully embrace dalits, adivasis, women, and Muslims? Do we obey the letter but often ignore the spirit of the Constitution? And when things go wrong, do we blame others rather than accept responsibility ourselves? Those are the issues I shall discuss today with the well-known and highly regarded columnist and author, the highly regarded historian of modern India, Ramachandra Guha. Ram Guha, in your recent column for The Telegraph to mark the 75th anniversary of India's constitution, you discuss B.R. Ambedkar's famous warnings of 1948 to 1949, which India seems to have ignored. Let's take them up one by one. First, Ambedkar warned Indians not to lay their liberties at the feet of great men. As he put it, bhakti in religion may be a road to the salvation of the soul, but in politics, bhakti or hero worship is a sure road to degradation and to eventual dictatorship. Now, this happened under Indira Gandhi in the 1970s. It's happening again under Narendra Modi today. In your eyes, how serious a lapse is this?
It's a very serious lapse, but before I come to how serious it is, Karan, let me give a brief historical context to Ambedkar's warnings. Ambedkar had seen the rise of Hitler, Mussolini, and Stalin in Europe. So he knew what cults of personality did to nations. In India, he worried about the excessive adulation to Mahatma Gandhi, which he'd also witnessed. And of course, Gandhi was not heading the state. But he thought they saw in India because it was interesting to our religion to have excessive devotion to our gods. He worried that it may be even more problematic than it had been in interwar Europe. And of course, he was prophetic about Indira Gandhi. There was a cult around Nehru, but never as so grand and extreme as it became under Indira Gandhi. And of course, it's reached ever higher heights under Narendra Modi. And it's true also of politicians who are running state governments and so on, which we can talk about. So this is a prophetic warning. I'd say this is one warning of his, which is reasonably well known. Some of the other warnings we'll discuss are perhaps less well known, but equally relevant to where we find ourselves today.
Talking for a moment about this first warning about bhakti and hero worship, doesn't it mean that prime ministers with dictatorial tendencies, be it Indira Gandhi or be it Narendra Modi today, not only get their way, but they are adulated and revered at the cost of our democracy and at the cost of our liberties?
Yes, and at the cost of free speech, debate, argument, discussion, a transparent and open government with a feedback loop, because the sycophancy starts within the cabinet, as with Indira Gandhi. Then it extends outwards from the cabinet to the party, the Congress for Indira Gandhi, the BJP for Modi. Then it expands further in the civil services and administrative infrastructure of the government and the state, then beyond that to the public at large. And Indira Gandhi used, you will recall, the medium of the radio and television, and All India Radio was mockingly but accurately called All Indira Radio, AIR. But Modi has much more because he has social media. He has so many channels on television, so-called Godi media channels. He has WhatsApp, Facebook, Twitter, Instagram. And of course, he himself, like Indira Gandhi, thinks he is destined to rule India, not govern India, not administer India, but rule India. If you think of how he named a cricket stadium after himself in Ahmedabad, that is Hitler-esque and Stalin-esque. I mean, at least Indira Gandhi didn't go that far to name a stadium in her own lifetime. After she died, many things were named after her, perhaps too many things. But to actually do this kind of, to not just encourage, but to welcome and further and enhance and expand this hero worship is something that Indira Gandhi did through all spheres of politics, administration, and the public at large.
Now, it's not just politicians that we put on pedestals. We also do that to cricketers, we do it to film stars, and increasingly, we seem to be doing it to businessmen as well. So let me ask you a wider question. Do you suspect sycophancy and hero worship are ingrained in the Indian character?
Yeah, and the sycophancy is both at the bottom of the social hierarchy and at the top of the social hierarchy. The top of the social hierarchy, if you compare India to America, Donald Trump, who is a megalomaniac and has authoritarian tendencies, faces criticism from top Hollywood stars, top basketball and football players, and even top industrialists. I mean, some have lined up to suck up to him, like Bezos and Zuckerberg, but there'll be others who'd stay independent. In India, it's like across the board. And so that's when it comes to politicians. When it comes to other spheres of life, I think Ambedkar would have understood, did not anticipate it, but he would have not been surprised that his worries about the excessive tendency towards bhakti are also manifest in sport, in business, in film. I can give an example. The example I would give is of Ratan Tata, who any serious scholarly objective analysis of his business career would regard it as flawed. Some considerable achievements, some hugely problematic disappointments. Ratan Tata's record is well below that of even people in his group like J.R.D. Tata or let alone Jamsetji Tata. But you wouldn't think of that when you see the uncritical adulation and encomiums heaped upon him. His failures are not discussed at all, and that is true also of as I said, our cricketers. When they are performing well, of course, occasionally when they perform badly, now there's a backlash against them. But this is where Ambedkar was so prescient. Bhakti in religion may be a route to salvation of the soul, but in politics, in social life, in business, it is a road to the weakening and undermining of democracy, and possibly even the creation of a dictatorship.
Now, the second warning from Ambedkar was about the need to expand our democracy from a political democracy to a social democracy. He was most concerned about dalits and women being left out. But the truth is, today, adivasis and Muslims are also largely excluded from the embrace of a full democracy. Am I right?
You're right. And before I expand on how you're right and why you're right, let's go back to Ambedkar's phrasing. Ambedkar said, with this constitution, we will be entering the regime of one man, one vote. Now we will say one person, one vote. But do we have one man, one value? So, yes, Dalits and women vote. Muslims and Adivasis vote every 5 years in the ballot box. But are they treated as equal citizens every day? On the street, in the home, in the factory, in the village, in the workplace. In public life, not at all. Ambedkar, because he came from a deeply disprivileged background, born in a Dalit home, profoundly understood the indignities that Dalits faced. Because he traveled abroad, he had seen, the women's movement in England and America. He was very aware of the indignities that Indian women faced and how patriarchy, Indian patriarchy, both Hindu and Muslim patriarchy in India, oppressed them. he was much less aware, because of the range of his experience of the discrimination against Muslims. So if you look at the great figures of our freedom struggle and the makers of our constitution, someone like Jawaharlal Nehru was much more aware when it came to protecting the rights of religious minorities and also women. But when it came to adivasis, they were largely invisible. And in our freedom struggle, the major leaders of the Congress party paid scant attention to the predicament of the adivasis. And I think that we are paying for that now.
If you add them up, Dalits, women, adivasis, and Muslims together represent more than 50% of the Indian population.
Yes.
And if the principle of one man, one vote, and one vote, one value does not apply to them equally or at least fully, this is a very significant lapse and failure. Doesn't it raise questions about how meaningful and effective is India's democracy?
Very much so. I mean, especially because we have our constitution recognized this. So our constitution had affirmative action for Dalits and Adivasis, two among these four groups. The constitution gave women the vote. It recognized gender equality as a principle of our democratic and political system. And of course, minorities were protected. We did not become a Hindu Pakistan. It was clear that originally the situation, of course, changed radically in the last decade or so. But as conceived by the framers of India's constitution, as understood and designed by the builders of India's independent republic, Muslims, Christians, Sikhs, Jains, Parsis, and even atheists were to have absolutely the equal rights as Hindus. This was not going to be a Hindu Rashtra of any kind, either overtly or covertly. So the constitution recognized aspects in which Indian society was layered, stratified, and it identified those discriminated groups and said, from now, from January 26, 1950, we will try and overcome those historic means of discriminating against Dalits, Adivasis, women, and in the context of partition and independence, Muslims as well. So it was recognized, but the progress has been in the last 75 years since the constitution came into force, has been painfully slow when it comes to Dalits and Muslims, has been largely static when it comes to Adivasis, and we've gone, I beg your pardon, I'll rephrase that. Progress in promoting one person, one value, has been painfully slow when it comes to Dalits and women, has been static when it comes to Adivasis, and we've gone backward when it comes to Muslims, particularly since May 2014.
And this is a major blot on our constitution, isn't it?
It's a major blot on our democracy. It's ways in which we have betrayed and diminished and set aside the principles of the constitution. Because the constitution recognized this. To the credit of those who framed it, not just Ambedkar, but the others involved in the drafting of the constitution, they recognized that India was a society deeply flawed because of these various forms of discrimination, hierarchy, and inequality. And the legal system, the political system, the social system that we were seeking to inaugurate on 26 January 1950 would, the constitution makers hoped, seek to ameliorate that and remove that.
Now, Ambedkar's third concern was about constitutional morality. As he put it, and I'm quoting, it is perfectly possible to pervert the constitution without changing its form by merely changing the form of the administration and to make it inconsistent and opposed to the spirit of the constitution. You believe this has happened repeatedly in India over the last 75 years?
Especially, I would say, since Indira Gandhi became prime minister and won a thumping majority in the early 1970s. Before that, for example, those who've studied the course of Indian democracy and Indian history, in the 50s and the 60s, the civil service, the judiciary, the regulatory bodies were occasionally inefficient, but they were not partisan. They were not serving the party or politician in power. Indira Gandhi introduced the idea of the committed bureaucracy, the committed judiciary, and so on. And of course, the Modi government has taken it even further.
Let's build on that particular point, because there's absolutely no doubt that Indira Gandhi's attempts to promote a committed bureaucracy or a committed judiciary were obvious examples of breaching constitutional morality. But Narendra Modi's treatment of the civil service, the police, the investigative agencies, the regulatory bodies, the judiciary, and even the election commission are surely also examples of the same thing, aren't they?
Yeah, and they're deeper and more dangerous examples. Karan, in a conversation with you on your show about 2 or 2.5 years ago, I described Narendra Modi as Indira Gandhi on steroids. I don't know whether you remember that characterization, but that characterization is even more true, even more valid than when it was first offered on this show 2 or 3 years ago. I mean, because apart from the civil service, the police, the judiciary, the election commission, there's deep skepticism about his impartiality, deep, growing, and often legitimate skepticism. And of course, if you look at the communalization of the Indian Army, which never happened under Indira Gandhi at all, and not just retired officers on their WhatsApp groups promoting hatred of minority communities, but serving officers accompanying politicians to the opening of temples and so on and so forth, and whole issues about how they present themselves in public. So I think this is it when it comes to the abdication of constitutional morality. Narendra Modi is certainly Indira Gandhi on steroids.
But it happened with Indira Gandhi right through the emergency. It's happening again, as you correctly and accurately point out. But there's nothing in the Constitution that can check it. Is that therefore a fundamental flaw in our Constitution, that it can happen so easily? We can criticize it and comment, but there's nothing we can do about it.
No, you see, my article in the Telegraph, Karan, which you refer to, has an epigraph from Ambedkar, which it said something to the effect of, I'm quoting from memory, this constitution is well framed. If it doesn't work, we'll have to say man is vile. Okay. Now, human perverseness, human vindictiveness, feelings of envy, jealousy, arrogance, prejudice, those will be there. Now, you expect when those are manifest, other institutions have to check them. If a prime minister gets too powerful, too arrogant, too authoritarian, you would expect people in his own cabinet, in parliament, to be able to check him. You would expect the civil service, the police, the judiciary, the army to retain their constitutional independence. You would expect the press not to be supine, but to be fearless and ask direct questions about those in authority. Now, if all these institutions collapse one by one, you would have to say Indians are supine. Even if Indians are not vile, Indians are spineless, supine. They have shown no character, no moral courage, and that has allowed this steamrolling of institutions and checks and balances that the Constitution sought to provide. It happened with Indira Gandhi. It's happening in a more again with Narendra Modi in a different kind of way. So institutions in many ways will function even moderately well only if they're not venal. I mean, Hitler and Mussolini came to power in theory through the ballot box. And look what happened afterwards. Stalin and Mao were authoritarians from the beginning because they constructed one-party states. Robert Mugabe, who was one of the most awful and brutal dictators of the 20th century, also came into power through the ballot box. So if the institutions don't hold their own, the institutions are supposed to hold a check against the excessive centralization of power and the abuse of power by a prime minister, who holds office. So I think Ambedkar also saw that was a possibility, because if the constitution doesn't function, it means man is vile. Not all men are vile, but the men who hold power, as well as the men who are supposed to hold power to account, the chief justices, the cabinet secretary, the president of the ruling party, the speaker in parliament. You can see how partisan the speakers in both houses of parliament are. They just don't allow free discussion. So I think this is what is happening.
Let me raise a related point, but another aspect of this issue. Many times the people appointed to bodies, particularly bodies like the Supreme Court, the Election Commission, or even the Information Commission, reflect what I would call the spirit of Hindutva rather than the spirit of our Constitution. Their loyalty is to the executive or to the Prime Minister, not to our constitutional rights and our liberties. Is that an aspect of the problem that sometimes doesn't get the attention it deserves?
So I would just agree with you, but I would qualify it. They often reflect the spirit of Hindutva. For example, the comments made by judges, senior judges recently in several high courts. Also, the visible presence of the army chief at religious functions and so on. but they also represent naked careerism and opportunism. The hope that if you're chief of army staff, or your cabinet secretary, or your head of the running the election commission, or your chief justice, the hope that if you just placate and please and follow the orders of the prime minister and the home minister, you'll be rewarded with a governorship or a Rajya Sabha seat or an ambassadorship or whatever. So it's also naked careerism rather than a fidelity to what the constitution expects of you. So Hindutva is only one part of why they behave like this.
Now, finally, Ambedkar warned that if things go wrong, we will have nobody to blame but ourselves. As he put it, and I'm quoting, by independence, we have lost the excuse of blaming the British for anything going wrong. If hereafter things going wrong, we will have nobody to blame except ourselves. The present regime, on the other hand, prefers to blame the Mughals, the British, and increasingly Jawaharlal Nehru, but will not accept any responsibility itself. Would you call that denial or myopia?
No, it's obviously denial. It's a diversion. It's a product also of the social media world, where it's always the fault of somebody else. In this case, the distant past, the weaponizing of history to say, the Mughals did ABCD, the British did ABCD, Nehru did ABCD. Now, it's a way of deflecting attention from your own faults, your own failures, your own creating and deepening the problems, economic, social, security problems we face. So, but it's a clear. Ambedkar said this. He said we cannot blame anyone else but ourselves. Now we have a prime minister who presents himself as all-knowing, all-powerful, authoritative, in command. He had two large majorities, and now he's just short of a majority. They control all the institutions, and yet if you're faced with any criticism, so if you're faced with criticism about China, it becomes, but Nehru did this. If you're faced with criticisms about the abrogation of civil rights, but Indira Gandhi did something else. If it's an issue about persecution of Muslims today, you say, but the Mughals did this to Hindus, 800 years, 600 years ago, and so on and so forth. So it is, the tragedy is that the media, the dominant section of the media allows this to happen, never interrogates them. The fact that the Prime Minister has not had a press conference for going on 11 years now means that no one can ask him a tough question. And of course, the fact that large sections of media are controlled by the very industrialists that benefit from this government, whose policies, whose extraordinary exponential increase in wealth over the last decade has been helped by favors from this government. So the media that they control, which is basically the media that dominates large sections of the population, to which large sections of the population are captive, never ask these questions. But we must ask them. We will ask them that you are a professedly, you profess to lead a government that is going to make India a Vishwaguru. You talk about being self-reliant, and yet you blame your failures on people long dead. Nehru, who died 60 years ago, the British who left 77 years ago, and the Mughals who, stopped ruling this country effectively with the death of Aurangzeb in 1707. And even when they ruled this country, as I point out in my article, they actually ruled less than half of what is now India. So if there's a problem in other parts of India, how could you? So it's really a way of deflecting attention. It's a way of not owning up to your own responsibility. It's an act of cowardice and moral, abdication.
Let me go one step further. If a government can't accept that it created a problem and is responsible for it, but instead seeks to blame others, isn't that a government that's never going to be able to correct the problem? Doesn't that follow?
Yes. Also, in this case, there's no feedback loop. Narendra Modi has no press conferences. The cabinet ministers are too scared to ever confront him with a question. Parliament isn't allowed to function as it should be because of the partisanship of those who run the house in both the lower and the upper house. And so on and so forth. The media is controlled and tamed. So the tough accountabilities are utterly absent. So, and accountability, transparency are basically fundamental to how a democracy functions. And in India, those are largely invisible now.
Let me then put to you a thought and ask if you agree with it. India has a good constitution, a constitution that has lasted for 75 years, when I believe the global average lifespan of a constitution is barely 19 years. None of our neighbors have had a constitution that's lasted for anywhere near as long as ours. But, and the but is the critical thought, often at critical moments, that constitution has been let down by people whose job is to enforce it or defend it, whether it's politicians in the executive, whether it's parliament, whether it's the judiciary. A good constitution let down at critical moments by the very people who should be defending it.
Karan, I am a historian of Indian democracy, of politics, of society. I'm not a constitution scholar per se. So let me invoke a great constitution scholar, Nani Palikewala, who said, 40 odd years ago, shortly after the emergency, he said something like this, and I'm again quoting from memory, but my recollection is largely accurate. He said, India is a second-class democracy with a first-class constitution. Now we are certainly a third-class democracy. I leave it to constitutional scholars to debate as to whether between 1946 and 1949, the Constituent Assembly could have fared better, whether proportional representation would have served us better than first past the post, whether it should be deeper federalism. So I'm not getting to that. But we have gone from being, for most of our life, except for the emergency, we were a second-class democracy. Compared to the really robust, well-functioning democracies, particularly of Northern Europe. I'm thinking of the small Scandinavian countries. We were a second-class democracy. But in the last decade and a half, we have become a third-class democracy.
But we still have a first-class constitution. It's just that we don't honor it.
I leave that to the constitutional scholars to pass. They may think that the amendments that have been brought in by successive governments have kind of sort of weakened the spirit of the constitution. But we have gone in my lifetime and your lifetime from being a second-class democracy to becoming a third-class democracy.
Ram Guha, let that be the thought with which we end this particular interview. It's something people can afford to spend time thinking about. I thank you for the time you've given me. Take care. Stay safe.
Thank you, Karan.
Hi, I'm Karan Thapar. Over the last few years, I hope you've been watching my program, The Interview on the Wire. During that period, I've interviewed doctors, politicians, businessmen, scientists, authors, and even the occasional Nobel laureate. For me, it's been exciting. I hope it's been enjoyable for you. But these, as you know, are tough times, and if this program is going to remain bold, independent, and sometimes even defiant, then I think we need your support. At the end of the day, it's a truism, but editorial independence is best defended by the viewers. So if you would like this program to remain the way it is, forthright, outspoken, and interesting, then would you consider supporting us? All you have to do is to click on the description at the bottom. But more than anything else, I hope you will continue to watch The Interview. Your viewership means an awful lot to me.